Weed, cannabis, Mary Jane, whatever you want to call it, the mystical plant has been a hot political issue for decades now. Recreational marijuana is now legal in 24 states, and the once partisan divide surrounding its use, legalization, and mainstreaming has been a bit blurred. I personally find myself evolving on the issue. I don't smoke weed. I've never smoked weed. I never want to smoke weed, but I do know a lot of folks who do, and they aren't all just liberals either. Personally, I find most casual and frequent potheads to be maybe a little lethargic, lacking ambition. I don't necessarily find pot smokers or any smokers to be becoming or attractive, but for those who use it to ease pain or as a replacement for big pharma drugs, well, I am intrigued by the alternative that it offers. So I find myself in the gray area, and I'm not alone. So today I've invited two guests from opposite sides of the weed spectrum to share with me and with you why they feel the way that they do. Joining me now is Dani Baranowski, Chamber of Cannabis Interim Executive Director and former U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission Commissioner, Anne-Marie Buerkle. Thank you, ladies, both so much for joining me to have this important discussion.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So, Dani,
excited to speak with you.
No, go ahead, Dani. I want to start with you because I think that the Chamber of Cannabis is very interesting. I would assume it's like the Chamber of Commerce, but more advocating for weed, recreational, medical, and the discussion is really intriguing to me because a lot of Americans are evolving on the issue. So I want to start with you kind of from the pro-weed perspective. Why is this such a passion project for you?
Yeah, we founded the Chamber of Cannabis in 2020. We operate just like a Chamber of Commerce, except for we have a few different initiatives, one of them being justice. We're a coalition united around the power of the plant. We recognize that cannabis is a huge economic impact to Nevada and certainly the entire country. We are on track to be a $70 billion industry. So we formed the organization by leaders, ran by volunteers who want to see the industry led with success and have the same opportunities as other industries to succeed.
I think that the capitalistic side of this is really interesting, and that's why a lot of maybe more conservative Republicans are evolving on the issue because it is a moneymaker. When Colorado started trying this whole thing out and the weed tourism industry kicked off, it made a lot of more conservative folks uncomfortable because it's just not something that people were used to. They weren't used to the mainstreaming of it, maybe necessarily. So I think that it's evolved since then when the dollar signs have been attached to it. Even people that don't use weed or don't want to use weed, they see it as an economic driver. So Anne-Marie, I want to kind of go to you on that. I know that you are not pro-weed and you're not pro-recreational use whatsoever, but when you look at the economics of it, do you think that maybe that's softening some of the hardliners on the issue?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I would say that that's not a justification for legalization, even if it provides a substantial amount of economic benefit to whether it's a town or a city or a county or the state or the federal government. Because if it is harming, especially teens, and I want to really kind of address my comments today, my concern is with teenagers and those under the age of 21, even younger adults. Those are the ones whose brains are not completely formed. They're the ones that are most vulnerable with this marijuana. And so those are really my concerns, are really from a health perspective.
Gotcha. So Dani, I want you to kind of answer to that as it relates to the health issues, maybe not for somebody who is 21 plus or somebody who is in the later stages of their life, but what about the use among teenagers? We know that smoking tobacco products, not good for you, vaping, not good for you. Do you argue that marijuana use is more acceptable, less acceptable, or somewhere in between?
I wouldn't say that it's more acceptable, but what I do know is important is comprehensive reform. All of the alcohol and nicotine industries are regulated for a reason to protect consumer safe and health and safety. So without these broad answers, states are making their own decisions. And over 69% of Americans want access and are going to vote for cannabis, lessening the prohibition. So I would counter that regulation is going to create more consumer health and safety rather than ignoring the issue.
Dani, have you seen that even though there is legalization and there's efforts towards legalization, these illegal weed grows, especially going down in California, that are not regulated, that unfortunately, some of these crops are not on the up and up. They have certain pesticides and other additives that make them dangerous. Is that a concern for the cannabis industry?
Oh, absolutely. Nevada is one of the most regulated states. And I think we need to provide a pathway that is safe and legal to the industry so that products are medical grade and that they do have that element of safety. They are lab tested. And yes, while we can all agree that smoking anything is never going to be good for you, but there are other modalities, and we as consumers deserve a different holistic option for healing, for mental health, from opiate addiction. Our veterans deserve an alternative for their PTSD, items like that.
Amory, I want to talk to you about that as well, because I know that you're focused primarily on young people. And it sounds like neither Dani nor I disagree with you on that premise that young people, they need to be careful, they need to be educated, it needs to be regulated. But when it comes to older people, when it comes to those who use it medically or even recreationally, we have seen a lot of our cities that have legalized recreational use, New York City being one that I travel to often. The weed smell is overwhelming. And for someone who doesn't smoke weed, I find it to be personally disgusting. I don't want to breathe in weed smoke. I don't want to breathe in regular smoke either. But do you have concerns, even, for those that are older in age, about what it's doing to communities who legalize? Can you talk to me a little bit about your precautions there?
Sure. And again, I think it has to do with, and you raised a great point. It's not being regulated at all. So for those who are in the medicinal camp, what you need is some federal regulation, a prescription program, rather than just willy-nilly. We are right now in the middle of a completely open border where we've got drugs coming in, uncontrolled drugs. And to the point about marijuana, it's easily, we know the rates of deaths with fentanyl. There has to be, at least for adults and for especially veterans. I served on the Veteran Affairs Committee in Congress, and oftentimes they would say that was a legitimate use of marijuana. But the question is the quality, the question is regulation, the question is overseeing to make sure that it doesn't do more harm than good. But I do think there's an aspect of medical marijuana that is really a slippery slope. And we've seen that throughout the country.
Dani, I want to ask you about something as well, just as far as it goes in pop culture. Just about a week ago, we had our Vice President Kamala Harris on with, I believe it was Jimmy Kimmel, and she was laughing about there's a strain of marijuana that's named after her, Kamala Kush or something like that. I don't know if it was real or a joke, but either way, she laughed and she took it as an honor that cannabis would be named after her or whatever. Do you think that there is a danger in maybe normalizing just weed use for the fun of it, for people like our vice president or others to make it seem almost like it's like the new cool thing to do, or that it's socially, morally acceptable or even encouraged? Do you think there's a line there when promoting cannabis use?
I think when we're talking about adults and what adults want to use, whether that be a glass of wine or they want to pick up a cannabis cocktail, that's up to you what you do in your own home. As far as normalizing it goes, I don't believe that there's that positive of a look for these politicians who have for so long ignored cannabis consumers, cannabis companies, and who are now stepping into the limelight trying to, pretend that they care about it. So my thought there really is, when it comes to normalizing it, everyone from my grandma to my mom is using a topical. There's so many different modalities and opportunities for people to find healing. When it comes to pop culture, who knows what people are going to learn on TikTok and what they're going to do. But what they do in their own home as adults, I believe, is your choice as an American citizen.
I want to talk about the criminal justice aspect of this as well, Anne-Marie, and I want to get your take on it. It seems to be, with the First Step Act and others in criminal justice reform, really pushed forward by conservatives and liberals, Republicans, Democrats, people in between, there seems to be kind of somewhat of a consensus that people shouldn't go to prison for marijuana. And we know that this current administration is changing the way that it's scheduled when it comes to, the legality of it or the punishment consequences therefore. What is your thought on that? Do you think that we should lower the bar for weed use or selling weed or whatever that may be, given that it's now legal in 24 states?
I think that there has to be some context around what you're saying. So if you are selling weed to a teenager or someone who's not of age and you run into problems that way, that's a very different offense than if you're just using it in your own home and you're an adult. So I think that all of it needs to be put into context. You mentioned that cannabis is legalized in like 24 states now in the District of Columbia. So you've got a patchwork of different rules and regulations per each state. So the federal government, if they're going to get involved, if they're going to legitimize, and I again go to the medical, the use of marijuana for medical reasons, then they've got to get their head in the game and they've got to make sure there's consistency with the quality, make sure it's all of the things that regulators do, sometimes do too much, but that they have to, the federal government's got to look at this thing more broadly than just state by state.
I think a lot of people are frustrated with that because people don't know what the rules are and the regulations are. And other countries treat it much differently. We know from Brittany Griner, who went to Russia, and that's a no-no there. So I would encourage people to know what the rules and regulations are to the places you're traveling, because it can get you in a lot of hot water. But Dani, let's talk about that a little bit as well when it comes to regulating and what that means to you and what that means to the commerce, the Chamber of Cannabis, and what you do and what you advocate for. Do you think that there should be national legalization and then strict regulation, or what would you see in an ideal world for you?
Sure. In an ideal world, we support sensible cannabis policy. We want to make sure that our elected officials have direct access to us. So we provide that conversation. We are the ones building this industry. We are in a nascent stage. There's no other industry that has the opportunity to be built and develop so quickly. When it comes to national legalization, I believe that we do need comprehensive reform. When it comes to regulation, I would invite, I do believe, I will say state by state, I think should continue to control and be able to monitor what they want to happen in their state. I think that's important. I think that states should look to Nevada, who, we're thought of as Las Vegas, Sin City. Well, there's a reason everyone can have that Vegas experience. It's because we are a highly regulated fun state. Everything should be medical grade. Everything should be safe, tested, approved. When we do have this prohibitionist attitude where you can have it in this state, but not this state, I think that's where you open the door to illegal behavior, drugs coming in from who knows where. So providing a safe access to patients and to adults, but regulating it so it stays out of the hands of children. I think that is exactly what this country needs to do. And I support that.
Yeah. Amory, I want to talk to you about, it used to be kind of the old adage of marijuana being a gateway drug. That's kind of always how I felt about it. I just felt like if young people saw it being legalized and they're like, okay, well, I can do weed because it's legal, and then weed's not enough anymore, so now I need to move to crack, and then I need to move to heroin or meth or whatever. I'm softening on that a bit. I don't know necessarily how I feel about it. I think some people are going to make it a gateway and other people are not. But I'm interested your take on that. Do you still feel that it's a gateway drug and that it's concerning maybe for that reason?
I do, Tomi, because I think when you've got a young brain, they're much more susceptible to addiction and to dependence on that drug and to take it to the next.
I think
next drug is for them. And so that's of grave importance. These kids are taking it thinking they're just going to get somewhat of a high, and they run into these problems where it is addictive. It can affect their heart, their lungs, their brain, especially their brains, because they are cognitively developing at that point. And that is my concern. It is the health aspects for these young kids.
Yeah, Dani, I mean, I kind of share a similar concern about that. We've heard for so long that weed is not addictive, that it doesn't really have long-term consequences. I don't know if we know enough to know what the long-term consequences are. We know that there are consequences of alcohol too, and that happens to be legal. So there's consequences to anything that you're going to do and partake in and get addicted to. But do you think that marijuana can be addictive? The people that I know that smoke weed, they sure seem addicted, but maybe it's different for everybody. I'm interested in your take on it.
Yeah, you brought up a very good point. We do not have enough research, and that is because of the decision to be scheduled at the same level as heroin. I don't believe that that's where it should sit, and it has really set us back on being able to have answers to these questions. Like I said before, I don't think smoking anything is good for you. We can all agree on that, but there are these different modalities. When it comes to, is it addictive? Is it not? Again, I think that people are, just like you said, get addicted to the way they feel. Their alcohol is an actual dependency that has physical repercussions. But at this point, there have been no deaths associated with cannabis. There's nothing to point to that's necessarily going to be so harmful that it deserves this classification. And I do think that this attempt to reschedule is not necessarily supported by the industry at large.
Okay, so you don't think that rescheduling it, as in like kind of declassifying it, that's not supported by the cannabis industry?
So two different things. Descheduling is where we believe we should sit with alcohol, with nicotine,
Okay.
things like that. But putting us on schedule 3 with like Tylenol, things like that is really going to set us back further as far as the economics of what each state has built. I think it's going to be very jarring to the industry. And from what I've heard, it's not broadly supported.
Wow, that's actually really
A step
interesting.
a step forward nonetheless. I will say it is important that we're discussing this, and it's important to recognize that it shouldn't sit at that level. But when we talk about all the other bureaucratic implications that are going to come through with this, I don't necessarily see that as the best path forward. Descheduling is what we would all prefer.
Ah, that's very interesting. Anne Marie, what's your take on that? I saw you nodding. I would assume maybe somewhat agreement with that.
Somewhat. My concern is that, and to both of you made this point, that there is not enough research done. And so without that research, and we've normalized something that used to be marginalized. And so it's really important to have that research before we just say it's safe or there are no long-term consequences when you use the drug. And again, I go back to that more protected class of young kids whose brains are still developing. I was at the CPSC for 7 years about, and you worry about kids' brains. We regulated helmets so that the helmet, when they were riding their bike, was as good as it could be, or football helmets. And so there's this concern about how the brain develops, how it grows, and to just put this unknown entity into the equation, I think is problematic. And I would just say we need more research. We need more certainty before we can just normalize this activity.
Yeah. No, I think we're kind of all in agreement on that. I think some of the moral outrage surrounding weed has dissipated a little bit. I know for me, like I'm from South Dakota, so anytime you tell people in a red conservative state, hey, we're going to legalize weed, I mean, people are just the moral outrage is really, the biggest factor there because people just don't, they look at Colorado and they say, listen, the weed tourism, the people that move there to smoke weed, uninhibited, it kind of turned into a problem for them because there was a lot of people moving to Colorado to smoke weed and then they were just smoking weed and they weren't working and they were living off the system and smoking weed. That was more of a problem early on when Colorado was the pioneer in it. Now I think it's evolved a little bit, but Dani, do you have any understanding of some of them maybe moral concerns, not necessarily of weed itself, but maybe the weed lifestyle? Is there a part of that maybe you see as problematic as well?
Absolutely. I'm also from a conservative state. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Wow.
So I think I can definitely speak to that. When I joined the cannabis industry, I joined it because I wanted to be a part of this emerging opportunity and I wanted to build something new and important that helped people. When I joined, my family very supportive of me and my dreams and goals, but there was a time where they were telling people, oh yes, she works in essential oils, and that's not essentially wrong either. But yeah, I've had to counter that a lot in my career, and when I go home back to Utah, all the things I've accomplished professionally. I'm a small business owner, co-founded Nevada's largest business trade organization, passed 4 bills in 4 years. I'm also a competitive cyclist. I can really say that what is true for some is not true for all. And there are a lot of folks using cannabis, like you said, that haven't necessarily come out of the green closet, to use an analogy, but people are using it in their own homes. And we may hear about these people that are lazy, and whether that be alcohol, cannabis, those are lazy people.
Yeah.
But there are people like myself that are high achievers that I like cannabis at night to help me sleep. My mind is always racing. I'm always thinking of the next business opportunity, some regulations, some legislation that need to be updated. And I think I deserve access to a good night's sleep.
Yeah. I do want to ask you too, because you brought up something that I think is important when we're talking about maybe the lifestyle and all that and the industry itself. Dani, have you seen any attempts by big pharma to squash the cannabis industry because it will cut into their profits? If people are using, like, for example, elderly folks using cannabis products instead of big pharma drugs, do you see the big pharma industry getting a little concerned about the cannabis industry?
I certainly think they're moving in the background. I think that it's for our seniors, who is one of the fastest growing demographics of new consumers. It's advertising hard to them, or also to veterans, right? Not allowing certain access to their benefits. And then I'm absolutely certain, and have seen it I can speak to mostly Nevada, that there are these huge lobbyists, these big organizations that are fighting and putting serious dollars into making sure it has a really hard time at being successful.
Emery, what is your take on that? Because I think that's really interesting. You know, as much as certain people might not like the idea of weed and wouldn't use it for themselves, I do think it's interesting that big pharma, you know, they might be a little nervous because they're getting, especially seniors, hooked on so many pills. And if seniors can just smoke weed or eat weed, they might cut into their profits. And I'm wondering if you think that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, I think we all agree that pharma has a very, very large lobbying shop, and they're very active on the Hill with most members of Congress. They contribute. They, look what they did with the vaccine, how they pushed that agenda. So for them, I think bottom line is the dollar and what they can make. And if this kicks into their profit margins, then I think they will fight it, and they will be aggressively doing it. It is, as you say, behind the scenes. They're very clever, I will say.
It's wild to me that, you know, even though we all have differing perspectives on it, and I'm in the middle quite literally and also on the issue, I think it's really interesting that we've had a lot of consensus on it. And I think that shows that there are Americans that come from different sides of the aisle, different perspectives, lifestyles, aesthetics, everything, and we can find agreement. And I think that's important. And I think that that shows that we are more alike on a lot of issues than people would maybe be led to believe. And I think maybe we can all unite against the grasps and the talons of big pharma, and maybe, just maybe, that's the solution to get everybody on board for a productive conversation. But I thank both of you ladies so much for being willing to have this really important discussion. And I think you both bring great points to the table, and we got a long way in discussing the issue in just a really productive fashion. So Dani and Marie, thank you guys so much for being with me.
Good to be with you.
Thank you guys. All right, folks, that does it for this Mary Jane special. I've learned a lot. We've come to maybe some sort of a consensus, maybe even slightly an agreement on all sides of the spectrum on this issue, which I love, and I hope we can do more of. Important conversations bringing Americans together through weed. Who would have thought? But I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. For this episode and every episode of Tomi Lahren is Fearless, please visit our YouTube channel at Tomi Lahren is Fearless, and I will see you right back here live Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern. But until then, from Nashville, God bless and take care. What's up, guys? Thank you for watching Tomi Lahren is Fearless. If you want more of my hottest takes, must-see conversations, and of course, my final thoughts, click here and make sure you subscribe here so you'll never miss a beat. I'll be here every weekday, and I hope you'll join me.